The things they're doing that are coming down the pike are incredible. Roll a patient with some sort of ailment into a room, use a robot or AR, VR to diagnose and treat, then roll out. I think that's really the future, is using this type of technology for the full spectrum of patient care, and the efficiency that will provide the medical community is where I see the excitement.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Joahn Ginsburg, an accomplished and high-integrity medical sales professional. She received her undergraduate degree at Santa Clara University and her MBA at Pepperdine University. She started her medical sales career at Stryker Endoscopy, selling into the operating rooms. Joahn then joined Intuitive Surgical, selling surgical robots and building strong robotic programs along the West Coast, and was promoted to sales director. The territory she covered went from lowest producing area in the country to the top producing in a span of 1 year. She now has a number of small startup businesses and consults for both customers and sales professionals. She lives in Mill Valley with her husband and 2 kids. And Paul, I know you've had a personal experience with Joahn because that's how he found her as a great guest to talk about a topic that hasn't been covered yet, which is robotics. And there's a lot to talk about on this one.
Yes, well, I've actually known Joahn since she was working at Stryker, and that's been many years now. But when I'm out consulting out in the field, I get a lot of questions about robots and when should I get one? How many should I have? Should I get XI versus an SI? And I really don't have all the answers. So what I do is I call Joahn and ask her and find out, what do I tell my client? Because you can't be an expert in everything, but she's certainly an expert in robots.
Yeah, and I know there's going to be some stories that come out on this episode, so there's going to be some entertainment value as well. We're going to be right back with Joahn Ginsburg after a short break.
You're listening to the First Case podcast.
Joining us now is Joahn Ginsburg, founder of Robotic Surgery Consult. And Joahn, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. Robotics is such a hot topic, and I'm not even sure that 30 minutes is going to be enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm so happy to be here. It's one of the topics I'm the most passionate about, and I can't wait to discuss it with you and Paul and Jeremy.
So why don't we start by having you give us some background. Obviously, you've got a great deal of experience in robotics, or you would have not founded a company that consults on the topic. Can you tell us about that and then also give us a detail about what your company does?
Yeah, so I entered into medical devices out of my MBA from Pepperdine, and I started at Stryker Endoscopy. They do the laparoscopic equipment. And my first day in the OR, I knew that was where I belonged. I couldn't believe what was on the line, what the surgeons could do, just the feeling in the operating room, and was hooked. And then I went from Stryker to Intuitive Surgical. And for anyone that knows much about the Da Vinci robot, it's fascinating. It can actually be pretty controversial, depending who's on the surgeon console. But it's very cutting edge. It's the future. And I've pretty much stuck with robotic medical device since then. And right now, I started a Robotic Surgery Consult. And what we do is we help hospitals buy systems. And what I mean by that is we help them navigate that messy, kind of complicated process. And I take my lens as a salesperson and as someone in the OR and combine them both to help them make the best decision.
Wow, that sounds needed so much, Joanne. I know when I'm going in and consulting at hospitals, I might get asked, well, gee, should I get a robot? Do we have enough demand to make it profitable? And I really don't know the answers half the time, most of the time. What is the level of demand that you need to have to justify a robot? How many cases a month do you think you need to use it in order to get somewhere with it?
Probably the number one question I get, and a very, very important question. It's an expensive product, hovering around $2 million. So it's an important decision for a hospital, certainly. And the answer to that is a little bit more nuanced than just me throwing out a number, but I'll give you a ballpark. So if I was just going to say for a robot to make sense in a hospital, that hospital should be doing 200 cases of elective surgery a year or more. That's just a blanket rule. You can actually be doing less. You can certainly be doing more. But if I had to throw out a number, I would say that's certainly kind of where you fall in seeing how you can make it profitable. But if I just want to give you a little bit more color there, what it really depends on is certainly usage. So if you have a really good surgeon on the Da Vinci robot and they're going to use it over and over and over again, and they get very proficient, then you can actually take the cost of the case quite a bit down. And sometimes it can even mirror a simple lap case. So it really depends on the surgeon on the console. It also depends if you're going to be able to attract more surgeons with the robot. There's certainly some other nuanced around it, but I like to just give people that ballpark of a number so they know, okay, am I around that target?
So if you have one surgeon that is doing 100 hysterectomies a year, or somebody is doing 50 gallbladders, just one surgeon may not be enough to cover it. But if you have multiples, you're in good shape. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. And I don't even mean 200 cases on the robot. I just mean the hospital is doing 200 elective surgery cases, because that just tells you the volume that's coming through the hospital is about where you'd want to see a robot. So it could just even be 70 cases a year on the robot specifically, but you just want to have that type of volume coming through the hospital, and you know that that's how much revenue you're getting in the OR.
I see.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I have to tell you a little story about one of my experiences with the robot. As you know, medical device companies often towards the end of the year offer their deals to meet some sales quotas. I got a call one December afternoon from our chief financial officer, and we've been considering purchasing the XI robot for a period of time. He says, Jeremy, I've got some great news for you. We just signed the contract for the XI robot. I've let Dr. X know, and he'll be ready to start surgeries on the XI robot in about 4 weeks. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's not just the robot that you have to buy. There's a whole lot of other stuff that can be incorporated into that. We ended up having to buy new washers, new sonics for the robot, and of course the training involved. Can you talk a little bit about the cost of all of those unanticipated costs that might occur?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up, because one of the things I really like to tell prospective customers when I was selling, and certainly in my job now, is that there are a lot of surprises if you just buy a robot. So I don't think anybody out there looking for a robot should just pull the trigger and buy it the next week because the surgeon's being loud enough. I think the number one rule I tell my customers and the staff is have staff members go on a site visit. And I know it's a little bit challenging now with COVID protocols, but really, if you can get the staff who are going to be in charge of the OR and this robot to go to a location and actually see the setup, the instrumentation, where they do the sterilization, what the surgeon looks like as he gets scrubbed in, all of that, it really opens your eyes to a ton of things you didn't think about. For example, the sonic machine or a different sterad that's longer that can accommodate the instrumentation. Even things like turnover. Is my room big enough? Is it the right size? Is it the right shape? All of those considerations, unless you see it really in front of your eyes, the salespeople are pretty darn good. I not to toot my own horn back in the day, but they can say, this is exciting, buy this, and they're right. But all those considerations really should be taken into place beforehand.
I think that's a really good point. The learning curve there, when you talk about turnover times, and we were an early adopter of robotic technology, specifically the Da Vinci robot. And I remember when we first started, the turnover times were, 45 minutes to an hour because of just the learning curve. When I left the OR about 3 years ago, I think we had it down to 20 minutes, sometimes even shorter if it was a shorter case. So there's definitely a learning curve that is involved in getting those turnover times, and people need to be able to understand and flow with that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I also think having a dedicated room, because, you can roll it's made of 3 components for any listeners who don't have the background: the surgeon cart where the surgeon sits, the patient cart where the patient's obviously prepped, and then the vision cart where you see what's inside the body. And those 3 devices are pretty big. And so, yes, you can move them around the OR, but you don't really want to. So I recommend a dedicated room where you can tuck it in the corner. Certainly the XI, if that's in your budget, because it does automatic setup of the instrumentation. But definitely train the staff and also really train the surgeon, because if that surgeon who's sitting on that surgeon console has done 100 cases before, or even used our simulator, which simulates a case 100 times before, it's going to be significantly shorter, quite obviously, than it would be if they had not. So those type of considerations will play into even the cost consideration as well.
Sure.
You mentioned something about having a dedicated room. What are your thoughts on hybrid rooms? Is that a good use of space? Does it depend on the size of the hospital? What are some considerations there?
Certainly. And it depends on the size of the hospital. Also depends on what technology you have. I think if you're looking to get the latest, the XI, and maybe even the Da Vinci Ion, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the newest, where they diagnose with lung biopsies. So it's another robot that you might have in the same room. So if you're going to do the top end products and multiple procedures and even maybe the diagnostic procedures, I love the hybrid room. If you're not, I think you can get away with a large room and not utilize that very coveted room.
Joanne, is there any structural or electrical issues that you need to be aware of when you're putting one of these robots in a room?
Oh my goodness. So the only thing that came to mind when you said that, I would say not normally. The one thing I would say is I learned this the hard way in my early sales days, that there are certain measurements on a lot of old hospital elevators that the patient cart doesn't fit in. So that can be a little hard to get them transferred into different floors. So I would just make sure you check, like I said, do a whole run through. What are the measurements of all of these devices? What are the measurements of our elevator? Getting it to the room. I think once you get it to the room, you're good, because there aren't really, like with Stryker, I think you're alluding to, Paul, and other endoscopy equipment, you might need to have different cabling through the walls. With intuitive surgical products, you don't. They're all pretty standalone.
You mentioned earlier that when you have an efficient surgeon, you can get the cost per case down. And I think that's one of the challenges many facilities have when they are evaluating these new technologies, is that there is a significant cost per case difference when we look at a laparoscopic case versus a robotic case in the beginning. What are the justifications there, and how do you best alleviate those?
Very good consideration. I think the rule of thumb is usually like $3,000 to $6,000 more than a general laparoscopic case for early adopters of the technology. And, that's not insignificant. The way I like to tell hospitals to set themselves up for success on this, because you can certainly get that down, is number one, have a training protocol for any surgeon that wants to use the Da Vinci robot. And the simulator, I'll describe it just in case listeners haven't seen it before. You think of it like a flight simulator. A surgeon can actually sit at this console and do a case like he or she is doing it live. And it really, really, really cuts down the learning curve and is very effective. So you can make that part of the training protocol. And I would have a hospital set up 25 cases on the simulator before you go on the actual robot, number one, because if they're proficient with that technology, the time goes down. And number two, what I always recommend is that you set aside specific instrumentation per case. Because a lot of times if you're in the OR and a surgeon's using something, they think, I think I want that longer grasper. Sometimes it's necessary, in which, of course, you say yes. But other times it's just a routine thing. So if you can get surgeons disciplined in knowing what instrumentation they're going to use per case and sticking to that unless things change, that's very helpful in cost as well.
So you just talked about training the surgeon, but what about training the rest of the staff? And I'd almost ask it this way, because I think it might get you to tell us a couple of good stories potentially.
Okay.
Give us an example of the wrong way to go about training the staff.
Oh my goodness.
And then give me an example of the best or most successful way to get everybody on board. I'm almost certain that when you tell me the wrong way, it's going to be with 24 hours before the first case that you start.
Oh my goodness. Okay, not only that. Okay, I'll elaborate. Certainly, you don't want to say, hey guys, guess what? We got you a robot. Next Tuesday, it's Monday, is going to be our first lap chole on it. That's not the way you want to go. Of course, that's a bit of a disaster. You also, as much as I love the reps who work for the company, and they are stellar professionals, you want nursing and other staff from another hospital training your staff before their case, because they know actually what it's like to be in a case, and they know what it's like to have that OR background. So you want to make sure your staff, and I mentioned this, I think earlier, has gone to a different location with a robot and has done an entire walkthrough, including prepping for a case, because there are some nuanced things that they miss. Like if a surgeon has a certain preference, do it this way. Those type of things that really matter, especially when you're starting off a case, to making it run smoothly. And so those two things, give them a lot of time, at least a month. Get the robot there. If you're really desperate, 2 weeks. You don't want to do any less than 2 weeks before your first case. And then also have another proficient in robotic staff training your staff. And it usually only takes a day, but that's a very valuable day.
So let me ask you one other question. Where's the blind spot? Who gets left out during that month of setup and prep, right? Because as the sales rep, you've got to deal with supply chain and then anybody who has a stake in the game. So where's the blind spot here? Who gets left out?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. I'd say a couple of things. One, sterilization often gets left out. And in a way on purpose, because some reps who might not be on the up and up kind of know, shoot, they may need this sterile equipment. That's a lot of money. They'll figure that out. That's okay. So sterilization definitely gets left out to dry often, and they left scrambling. The other thing I would say is the surgeons who aren't as proficient but are very eager to use it, they might be the ones that can end up bringing a lot of volume to it, but they're not getting the training and the looks that they need to be proficient on it. And that's a very important thing for outcomes. So if you get a surgeon really eager to use it, but hasn't gotten the attention and the training by either the staff or the reps, because they're thinking, you know what, not a lot of volume, he can use it whenever he or she needs, that ends up being the cases that have adverse outcomes.
So, Joanne, what are the best cases? What are the best procedures for robotics? It seems like there's some that are just lend themselves to it and others that maybe aren't quite as necessary. Where's the line on that?
So I would say if you have a case that already has a gold standard of surgery in your hospital, stick to it. So for example, if you have a surgeon in your hospital that does single incision laparoscopic cholecystectomy with laparoscopic equipment, takes 12 minutes, really gold standard procedure, stick with it. You don't need the robot. But if you have procedures like a hysterectomy or a prostatectomy, those are two cases that the robot is actually the gold standard, certainly doing it on the robot as long as the surgeon's proficient on it. But I think where it gets a little bit more complicated is when you have procedures that are maybe considered up and coming or new adopting. For example, a colectomy, an inguinal hernia, an incisional hernia. I think all of those have really good medical and outcome reasons to use a robot. But I think the consideration should be made, is that surgeon proficient enough on the robot to move from their current modality of doing it to the robot? Have they done enough practice? And if they have, I think the outcomes can be good in those cases, but only if they have.
So you're talking about new procedures that are up and coming.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get those physicians credentialed for those procedures? There's always kind of a gray area that once they've become credentialed for the robot, what about doing these new types of procedures?
Yeah, very good question. So I think we talked about earlier, what are some things to think about when purchasing a robot? And I think these type of protocols and decisions should be made before the robotics program is started. So things like credentialing, for example, maybe it takes 25 cases on the simulator to be credentialed in general. But then any new case, any new type of procedure you want to do in the robot, maybe you have to do 15 of those on the simulator. You have to see one live and you have to have 4 proctors before doing your own. So I think I don't want to put on every hospital my certain protocols that I would recommend. I think each hospital can look over the data that we have a lot of it. I have a lot of it I can share and make the decision on their own. But I think it's important to have that decision beforehand so a surgeon doesn't get excited by this new technology and decides tomorrow they're going to do a colectomy with fluoroscopy because it's exciting. I think you have to have those stop gaps in place for sure.
So we've talked a lot about the logistics and getting the robot. Can you talk to us a little bit from the patient perspective? What are the benefits of robotic surgery versus traditional open surgery or even laparoscopic surgery?
Sure. I mean, I actually am personally a patient, so I can tell you from my own experience, and then I'll tell you what the literature says. But from my own experience, I, about 4 years ago, had some endometriosis concerns, and the surgeon would have to go in laparoscopically and remove endometriosis from inside my abdomen. Now, I wanted to do it quickly because I was currently trying to get pregnant. And if you're a woman out there and you want to get pregnant, you want it tomorrow. But I did take the time to find the best robotic surgeon and do it robotically. Even though it was what they thought would be a relatively simple case, I did it robotically. And the outcome was I can't see an incision. So here I am 4 years later, and I'm no bikini model. So it doesn't really matter. Although to some people it matters more than others, but I have no incision. And that's really nice to have as a patient. There's no mark there. I also left the hospital 4 hours later, which is pretty unheard of. And the pain was very minimal. I had laparoscopic surgery 2 years prior. And I remember there was a lot of gas in the abdomen, up in the shoulder, and pain around the incision site. So the pain wasn't there. I didn't fear for blood loss. So it was a really smooth procedure for me as a patient. And then if you think about the literature, all those things are really proven in the literature. Lack of pain, low to no incision site, really low to minimal blood loss, and back to daily life really, really quickly. On top of that, one more thing I will add is you can use the robot to do cases that you would have done open. And so you can imagine the change in the recovery from an actual open incision versus just some small little hole.
So all this is fantastic, but what are the risks associated with robotics?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what can go wrong? What are the things you really have to keep an eye on? What are the challenges there?
So first thing I like to remind everybody of is sometimes when people think of, oh, I'm getting robotic surgery, they think of a robot kind of going into the room like, here I am to do your surgery. That is certainly not the case. This is just a tool. So it's a tool a surgeon uses. So the tool is only as good as the surgeon. So because it's such a powerful tool and there's a lot of depth perception, articulation, it's a really good big tool, the surgeon seems to even have more power. And so you want to make sure the surgeon using the tool is really proficient because it's different than anything he or she may have used before. So really the lookout is, who is the person using this technology? Have we trained them enough? Have we trained the staff enough? Have you made sure this is actually the right tool for that patient? So I think if you can answer yes to all those questions, the risk is pretty minimal. But if you're iffy on any of those, that's where the risk comes in.
All right, just a couple of more questions here, Joanne,
Yeah.
and you're doing a great job. This is an excellent interview.
Oh, thank you.
And one of the themes that I hear all the time on this from and really it can be anybody in any position in the hospital. The topic of robotics is not isolated to the operating room. It stretches to the marketing department, which is really where my question is coming from. There seemed to be a strong sense from the marketing department at a hospital that we need to have our name on a billboard that says we do robotics to stay competitive in the marketplace. And so is that true? Do you believe that is in fact what hospitals need to do to stay caught up? Because it kind of gives them an impression that they're doing the latest and greatest.
Yeah. I like your question, and I like the skepticism in what you asked that question too. Because really the answer is no. So do you want to have a billboard by your competitor that says, we have all this new technology, X hospital down the road is stuck way back in the 1990s? Of course you don't want that. But do you need a billboard with the robot on it and a patient's going to say, oh my goodness, that's the hospital I want? I really don't think the literature is there to back up that claim. What I think the marketing department is getting at, and maybe where the real answer lies, is how do you get the best surgeons in your hospital and how do you market to them? And this tool can actually be very effective in that. But I don't agree with the direct to patient marketing, because I didn't pick my hospital for my surgery because they had a robot. I picked my surgeon because I know that surgeon is good. And that surgeon, who's very top of the line, is proficient on the robot.
So, Joanne, what's the future of robotics? I recently read an article about with 5G technology, you might have Dr. Smith in Omaha, Nebraska, who's the greatest in one particular procedure, operating on a patient somewhere in Los Angeles or vice versa. Is that the future?
That is the future, and the future has already happened. But I've actually witnessed a case being done like that. Pretty remarkable. And the technology is there. The question is really the lag time, and 5G seems to be the way to mitigate that. But not just the future of robotics is really, I'm even more excited about it than I think what I've already been through, which is pretty darn exciting because it's about the full spectrum of care for a patient. And what I mean by that is you can roll a patient in the room and the type of things they can do with robotics and also augmented reality, virtual reality, different ways to recreate the brain on a screen so you can actually like go inside and see different pieces of the anatomy. The things they're doing that are coming down the pike are incredible. Roll a patient with some sort of ailment into a room, use a robot or AR, VR to diagnose and treat, then roll out. I think that's really the future, is using this type of technology for the full spectrum of patient care, and the efficiency that will provide the medical community is where I see the excitement. That, and if I may add one more thing, cost. Okay, so competitors are coming on the market. It's going to bring down the cost, and everybody needs that.
Wow.
Yeah. So, Joanne, here's the thing that really strikes me as I listen to you talk. There's a great deal of complexity in setting this up right. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of potential pitfalls that can make this not a great experience for the staff and the leadership at a hospital. And I can see why you have this opportunity to consult in this arena, because it sounds like with your level of expertise, there's no stone unturned, mm-hmm. which is pretty critical. And I think Jeremy has one more question for you before we wrap, but I think you did an excellent job of detailing all of that. And certainly would encourage folks to reach out to you for assistance if they're looking at. And I'm assuming that you also help out with upgrading.
Yep.
Because I'm sure there's technology considerations and compatibility that also needs to be discussed when you do that.
Yes. And I do want to pull out there that I take phone calls. If you call me with a question, 5, 10, 15 minutes, I do those for free because I believe in this technology and I believe in the power of knowledge with this technology. I like it to be used for good and I like it to be used right. So if you have a question, hopefully they'll link my work number on there, but I'm happy to answer it.
Just have one follow-up, and it's out of curiosity. I think we focus on one primary manufacturer when we mm-hmm. get robotics, and of course that's intuitive. Are there other systems out there? We know that there's the Mako robot mm-hmm. for orthopedics. I believe there's a spine vendor as well. Are there mm-hmm. others that are coming into the market that are going to make it more competitive?
Yes, there sure are. So just up at the top of my head, on top of those, you've got the Medtronic, the Hugo robot set to launch in a few years, which they hope to bring down the costs. That can be used in general surgery as well. And then you have the CMR surgical robot. So if you're looking at an international landscape, their MAS, their mass robot, is about to get Eurasia clearance. So that has the potential of hitting into some intuitive market overseas. And then finally, J&J has the Monarch robot now, and that targets lung cancer. So they're currently using that. They're trying to launch the Ottava. That's their general robot. A number of these competitors, Medtronic and J&J included, have been trying to launch a robot for a number of years. They're definitely closer than they were before, but I wouldn't bet they'll hit the market next year. I'd say they're still 2-3 years away. And Intuitive Surgical has done a pretty decent job of trying to pick up more patents along the way. So I'm hopeful these other robots will hit the market because I think it's good for everybody for it to drive down cost. But I think if J&J can pull together that Ottava and if Medtronic can pull together the Hugo, I think that'll really blow up the market.
All right, Joanne, great job today. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast. And I have a feeling we may have you back on again in the future.
Would love it. I'll talk about augmented reality, virtual reality next.
Wow.
That's my passion.
Yeah.
Oh,
like
I'm all about
idea.
that. Yep, you're in the queue.
All right. Thank you so much. Great to talk to all of you.
That was Joahn Ginsburg, founder of Robotic Surgery Consult. And one of the things I love anytime I do an interview, and in this case, it's very true, not only does she have experience in selling the robot and setting it up for hospitals successfully, Jeremy, but she has a personal experience in having had a procedure where the robot was used. And I gotta say that always lends such a great deal of additional credibility to somebody's perspective, especially on newer technology.
I agree with you, Justin. I think that robotic surgery is foreign to a lot of people, and to have somebody that not only has experience in the sales of the robot, but those Intuitive reps, I know from having worked with them how involved they are within the operating room, in between the circulators and the scrub techs, as well as sterile processing and the surgeons themselves. But she also has that personal experience. And I think that does, I agree with you, add a lot of credibility to her story. So it's very, very interesting to hear her perspective.
Yeah, and I love the insights on the blind spots because she makes such a great point. This is a significant investment for a hospital. For that to go poorly, it can really change the entire attitude towards it, as you mentioned, especially by the circulators and the scrubs, because nothing worse than just, hey, it's going to come in and we're going to do a procedure next week and good luck, to really, get people a little riled up.
Definitely.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Jeremy, Paul, and myself, thank you for listening to this episode of First Case.